Hi all, thank you for joining today. This is a session for centering of SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals. And this panel is where, or this entire session or the series is where our young people or youth have planned sessions globally, starting from various cities in India. Then we have New York, New Jersey participating, and then some people from the Philippines. So we have today Eco Ambassador Aalok Bhatt, who has really been championing a lot of eco activism and a lot of thinking around environmentalism, not just with like general things that we can think of, but really thinking out of the box and tending towards environmental justice. And Aalok has a very special guest today. I'll ask Aalok to introduce her and get on with the panel, please. Thanks,
Thank you,
Aalok.
Dr. Iyengar. And I would like to introduce my esteemed panelist, Dr. Denise Lajimodiere. Dr. Lajimodiere is a citizen of the Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa in Belcourt, North Dakota. She has been an educator for 44 years as an elementary teacher, principal, and professor, earning her bachelor's, master's, and doctorate degrees from the University of North Dakota. Dr. Lajimodiere is a retired associate professor from the School of Education and Leadership program at North Dakota State University, Fargo. She is also one of the founders of the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition. Dr. Lajimodiere is a poet who has written 4 books: Dragonfly Dance, Thunderbird, Bitter Tears, and His Feathers Were Chains. She has also written a children's book called Josie Dances and an academic book, Stringing Rosaries, The History, the Unforgivable, the Healing of the Northern Plains Boarding School Survivors. Dr. Lajimodiere is also a traditional jingle dress dancer, Obijwe, correct me if I'm pronouncing that wrong.
It's Ojibwe.
Ojibwe, sorry.
Yeah.
Birch
That's
bark biting artist, and lives in a cozy cottage by a lake on the Turtle Mountain Indian Reservation. And before I start the interview, I'd like to give everyone a brief history of the Native American residential schools. As the US government enforced the Indian Removal Act in 1830, Native Americans were forcibly removed from their land and pushed in the reservations to make way for European settlers. As the United States stretched from coast to coast, there was no more land left to relocate Native Americans. So the US came up with an alternative solution for the quote-unquote Indian problem. It was to assimilate them into the mainstream. The slogan was, "Kill the Indian, save the man." And it came from Army Lieutenant Richard Henry Pratt. He came up with the concept of boarding schools where children as young as 2 years old were forcibly taken from their families and sent to boarding schools far away so that they can be educated and civilized to be more like the white man. He set up the first boarding school in 1879 in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and this was followed by 367 such schools in the US and many more in Canada. The real purpose of these schools was not education and assimilation, but to wipe out Native culture, languages, and families and replace them with white European Christian values. Children who went to these schools were not educated, but trained in menial jobs and sent to work for white families in the summer. They were physically, psychologically, and sexually abused, beaten up, and forced to follow military-style drills. Homesick and lonely and unable to speak their language or tolerate this abuse, many of these children died there, and those who did not survive did not find acceptance into the white world and could not fit back in with their tribal communities. The abuse they suffered affected their own mental well-being and their trauma, which was passed from one generation to another, leading to widespread drug and alcohol abuse and depression that continues to this day. Dr. Lajimodiere's parents were boarding school survivors, and the horrors they experienced there affected the way they parented their own children. Dr. Lajimodiere finally broke the cycle of intergenerational trauma and educated herself, and is now a powerful advocate for boarding school survivors, recording their unspoken stories and raising awareness on this dark chapter that is left out from the history we study today. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. That's a great, I like 500 years of history in 3 minutes. Very good.
Thank you. And for my first question, I would like to start in your essay, A Healing Journey. You talk about your father's soul wound lit only in the final years of his life after watching the documentary In the White Man's Image, that he realized what the government had done to them. Can you tell us more about the unresolved grief and how it leads to historical and intergenerational trauma?
Yes, thank you. Great question. Yes, I'll just give a definition of historical unresolved grief. And that is grief that's resulting from the historical trauma of attempted genocide and the cultural genocide that you just talked about, and grief that has not been expressed, acknowledged, or resolved. So Papa, he didn't know terms such as historical grief, historical or intergenerational trauma and unresolved grief. He didn't know any of that. I didn't either at that time when I showed him the video. It wasn't until I started doing research that these terms started popping up from other people's research. Mostly the words came from the Jewish survivors and their children. And then it's been applied through other professors to what happened to us as a tribal people. So yeah, it started out with attempted genocide. The only good Indian is a dead Indian. And Pratt actually believed in that, but he said he rather favors his saying, kill the Indian and save the man. So he was a rabid assimilationist. He liked Indians, but he hated the culture. And his program that he set up was a program of forced assimilation and forced Christianity. So a definition of intergenerational trauma and historical trauma: collective emotional and psychological injury over a lifespan and across generations, resulting from cataclysmic history of genocide. It is a legacy of numerous traumatic events a community experiences over generations. Over successive generations, we have experienced traumatic assaults that have had enduring consequences for our families and communities. So an example in my family of historical trauma is my great-grandmother, who I remember well. Was 12 years old, and she was close to 100 years old. So she had experienced the Indian Wars. So then she had 4 boys, and she sent those 4. Well, they got taken and sent to boarding schools. And one of those boys was my grandfather, my mom's father, and he sent my mom to boarding school. So besides the historical trauma of having witnessed, the Indian Wars and putting us on reservations, and then the cultural genocide of putting in boarding schools, that is the historical trauma that is in my family. There's something called epigenetics, where it's passed down through our DNA. So even though I was not sent to boarding school, my parents, there is no way they would send us to boarding school. I still suffer, and my brother and sister and families all across, Native people all across the Turtle Island here and in Canada, across the medicine line, still suffer the effects of the forced assimilation through boarding schools.
Oh, yeah, I actually researched the point epigenetics and my research paper, and I also found like a Holocaust survivor had like the same like genetic markings as a veteran from the war in Iraq, like a descendant of a Holocaust survivor.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah. So that's been important research that's been applied to us.
And so my next question is, as a child of parents who were boarding school survivors, what was your experience while growing up, and how did it define your early years?
In my book, Stringing Rosaries, the last chapter is my healing journey. It's about my father and, both my parents. So we were disciplined the way they were disciplined. And you mentioned about the severe, the beatings, the type of punishment that was meted out. It was military style punishment. So my father was beaten with the belt. He was nearly killed in something that was called the gauntlet. And, hit constantly. He didn't speak a word of English when he went to boarding school, neither did Mama. So they were punished in the closets. They were made to kneel on broomsticks. It's a stress torture. It's a torture that they use in places like Iraq and Iran and so on. So we were disciplined the way they were. So we had to kneel in a corner, but we didn't have to kneel on a broomstick, but we had to kneel up to 30 minutes in a corner. Mom would make us, my sister and I, we fought a lot and kneel in the corner. But my dad was pretty free with his belt. And the sad part is that he did most of the beatings with my brother. And I think it was just this, like we talked about, this unresolved grief. He was probably in PTSD, both from boarding school and from the World War II. and he took it out on my brother, mostly when he was drinking, and also my mom. So we witnessed a lot of abuse growing up until I ran away when I was a sophomore in high school, and so did my sister, just to get away from a lot of verbal abuse too, especially when he became an alcoholic. When he was sober, he was wonderful. He was outgoing, and he had a killer sense of humor. He's funny as hell, but he drank almost every night too. So that's the legacy. That's just my family, but it also carries across from hundreds of thousands of Native families.
Sorry I had to go through this. And
a lot of therapy. A lot of therapy. I think you talk about what's healing. So for me personally, and I talk about it in my essay, just a lot of therapy.
So my next question is, you've spent many years visiting the boarding school survivors and recording their stories for your book, Stringing Rosaries, The History, the Unforgivable, and the Healing of North American Boarding School Survivors. Why are these stories important?
Yes, when I first joined the Native American Boarding School Healing Project, is what it was called at the time, the other three gals that were involved in that, they were professors and educators, even a filmmaker. They wanted a book about recording the human rights abuses of what happened to children at these boarding schools. And I said, I can do that. So it took 12 years and 12 years of research and interviewing and writing the book. But I said that's what I would do. So I had already interviewed, like we said, my mom a little bit. She died when I was 24, so I didn't get as much of a chance to interview her about her boarding school stories. And my dad's mother had died in the 1918 flu epidemic, so I didn't get to interview her or my grandfather. But anyway, I interviewed my mom's grandfathers and my father. So I'd already started some interviews. So they had a protocol. They had a list of questions to ask and so on. So I, as a professor, on a tenure track, we need to publish our papers. So I submitted an IRB to the university and got permission to start doing research and interviewing. It's a qualitative interview study. And I just put something in the newspapers here in North Dakota that anybody that wanted to talk about their boarding school experience, whether it was good or bad, to contact me. So I had quite a few people contact me over the years. And even after the book is published, I've continued recording interviews, mostly because I don't want the world to ever forget, what happened to our people, what happened to my parents. And one of the ladies, she didn't want me to use her name. You'll notice in the book that there's some names that are pseudonyms. A lot of them hadn't talked about their experiences to their children. They said, I have to suffer and think about this every night. I don't want my kids to ever have to think about what I went through, or my grandkids. So many of them are, I didn't use their real names, but one of the ladies, she said, please tell the world what happened to us. And that's why I do interviews like this and ask you to continue telling the world what happened to us through this book and through these interviews and conferences and whatever you can to get the word out.
Makes sense. Like it's like I can't imagine how tough it is to even come out with even several years later about what happened at these horrible places.
Yeah, some of them, like my auntie was 96 years old. Some of the women I interviewed were in their 70s and had never told anybody except their husbands what had happened to them. So I call it America's best kept secret, but it also, I call it a resounding silence from boarding school survivors. And I know it's because the trauma is so horrific that they can't talk about it. One elderly gentleman, he said, I'll keep my story right here. And he pointed to the back of his head. Well, we know that in therapy, we're only as healthy as our secrets. So our people, many are not very healthy because they've stuffed down that abuse. And so when Kamloops happened, when the international and national news got a hold of Kamloops and finding the unmarked graves there, boy, it triggered a lot of boarding school survivors. And I'm worried about them across the United States, because when things come unstuffed, you need someone to be there to help you process it, to help you, through talk therapy, or if you need medication, because many can become suicidal. So they needed a lot of support. And here in the United States, we just didn't have any support like they did in Canada. They have a number to call, and they have 130 healing programs up there that they had gone through in their communities across Canada. So we didn't have anything. We had the National Boarding School Healing Coalition, but we didn't have a national number or anything to call. Some of the people that I interviewed in the book called me and said they were having a hard time, and I encouraged them to get back into therapy or talk to someone, ceremonies, whatever healing looked like for them individually.
On your point about what you were talking about what Canada has done, so Canada set up a Truth and Reconciliation Committee to acknowledge and apologize and make amends to tribal nations who lost their children due to death and abuse of these schools. Why don't we have a similar push over here? And do you think that having Deb Harland as Interior Secretary will help set up such a committee?
Yes, to go back a bit with Canada, back in the mid 1990s, they started a class action lawsuit against the abuses, the sexual and the physical abuse that happened to them at boarding schools. So they could do that, but we can't do that here in the United States because of the statute of limitations. So they ended up pulling together over the years, until just a few years ago, about $5 billion. They were each given so much money for the years that they were in boarding school. And if they had to go through a lawyer and talk about, if they were sexually molested, which was a horrible experience for so many of the survivors. But we can't do that. We don't have the monies or the class action lawsuit. We can't do that here in the United States. Part of that was the the TRC, the commissioners. So when we were starting NABS back in 2011, we met with the commissioners and talked to them about what we wanted to try and do. So now, they have the monies to do that. When we started NABS, Boarding School Healing Coalition, back in 2011, 2012, we had $5,000 to do what they had $5 billion to do. So recently, Deb Harland was voted in as Secretary of Department of Interior, which is wonderful. Kamloops happened. Kamloops started telling the news media, you better look south to our neighbors across the Medicine Line, because the same thing happened there. In fact, Canadian boarding schools were based through the Blevins Act, based on Richard Pratt's model of boarding schools. So just recently, if you go to the Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition website, they are asking us to do resolutions, like tribal council resolutions. So I have one that I'm going to go present to the tribal council this week, supporting, it's a statement and support for the Truth and Healing Commission on Indian Boarding School Policy Act and bolstering initiative. So that's kind of been renamed. It was a Truth and Healing Commission. So we're trying to get it through Congress. It hasn't gone through yet. It's Secretary Deb Harland and Elizabeth Warren. So that's, and why do we need that? So there's never been an accounting of the number of children forced to attend these schools, the number of children who are abused, died, or went missing while at these schools, and then the long-term impacts on the children and the families of children forced to attend the boarding schools. So that's what we're hoping. And then there would be a commission set up, and it'll do similar to what the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, TRC, we did in Canada. They would get a committee together and go throughout the United States and start taking testimonials. And I hope to be on that committee. So yes, so we're trying, but we're just so far behind. The Boarding School Healing Coalition, we've been in place for over a decade. And just now, because of what happened at Kamloops and the wonderful position that Deb Harland is in, has brought this more to a light here in the United States. So it's just now getting to where we wanted it to be when we started the organization. Our goal was to bring the issue of boarding school problems to a national attention. So it's just now happening.
hopefully this increased awareness can pressurize Congress into passing this legislation through.
Yeah, we're hoping to with all of these organizations. I think we have bipartisan. I was going to look it up, but there's a list of Democrats and a list of Republicans that have signed on to this already. So yeah, it's just now it's getting it passed through, and then of course it needs funding in order to make a commission happen.
Yeah.
And then from there, we'll have to decide where we go from there. If that happens, I hope it happens in my lifetime.
Yes, hope so too. And my next question: when I read an article on the Carlisle School for the first time, I was shocked, and I wondered why we were not taught about this in school. The United Nations Sustainable Development Goal 4.7 states that by 2030, all learners should acquire the knowledge and skills needed to promote sustainable development through education for sustainable development and sustainable lifestyles, human rights, gender equality, a promotion of a culture of peace and nonviolence, global citizenship, and appreciation of cultural diversity and of culture's contribution to sustainable development. Worldwide, there is a trend to decolonize historical narratives and redesign school curriculums. As an educator, how important is it to teach about this chapter of our history in schools? And is anyone working to bring about this change?
Yes, yeah. There's one state, Michigan, that I believe they are going through their state legislature to get it sort of like mandated that boarding school history be taught in their school curriculum. North Dakota just now passed a bill where we have to just teach Indian studies in general to the children here in North Dakota. So we're just now at that level. So yeah, it's important that I mentioned, I called it America's best kept secret. So when I've been talking about boarding schools to colleges and high schools for about 10 years. When I first started, nobody in the audience, none of these students knew anything about boarding schools. I'd ask them to raise their hands. So it's not in the history books. One reporter, and I've talked to about 50 different people and reporters over the past 8 months, well, since last June. She said, well, you've been written out of history. And I said, well, we weren't written into history. We weren't written into the history books. I mean, this is a pretty horrific era, the boarding school era, which ended about 1979 here in the United States. We still have boarding schools operating, but they're now run by tribes, and they're not the boarding school era that I'm talking about. So yeah, it's America's best kept secret. So we need to write curriculum and get it into the history books. There's a lot of books in Canada that are being written. They're memoirs, and there's a lot of books written for middle grade level, YA level, young adult level, and even picture books about boarding schools. But that's in Canada, which I've ordered all of them, so I have as many that I can, about 50 of them. But in the United States, there's one children's book, just one, and it's out of California, and it's a true story. But it's a picture book about boys that went, I think, to Riverside, and then they ran away and made it back home. So the United States is just even behind there. We have about 10 books or so more, some memoirs and so on, and some other academic books about some of the boarding schools themselves, like Chilocco, a lot of books about Carlisle, which was the first off-reservation federal boarding schools. Since the 1800s, there were Christian boarding schools. There's I think 14 denominations of Christian churches that had boarding schools: the Quakers, Protestants, Episcopalians, Presbyterians, Catholic, Baptist, Lutheran, Mormon, so on. All of those Christian organizations had boarding schools, and they were all what I call hellholes. They were all horrible, horrible places for Native kids to go, no matter which Christian organization belonged to. Quakers they were the first ones to help the Boarding School Healing Coalition with doing research on how many boarding schools they ran. So we at least have a number of boarding schools that they ran. And you mentioned 300 and something. In my latest edition of my book, Stringing Rosaries, I have 406 boarding schools listed there, and I found 2 more boarding schools since then. So no one ever asked the United States, how many boarding schools did you run until now, until Deb Holland. No one ever asked the Catholic Church, how many boarding schools did you run? The Jesuits now, I believe, are looking for doing their own research, which is what I've been asking for 10 years. Please do your own research. That we need to know Presbyterian, Episcopalian schools. So doing that research is very tedious and painstaking and frustrating, going through the documents.
I have a question from one person in the crowd. Have any of these Christian denominations officially apologized or made statements?
You're asking me, or?
Yeah.
Oh heavens, no. No one's apologized. No. We'll get maybe one church in, say, a little town in Washington State out on the West Coast. That church will apologize, but we're waiting for an apology from the Pope, which again probably won't come in my lifetime. He doesn't look like he's just as leaning toward that, as much pressure as he's getting, especially from our Canadian relatives across the medicine line. But no, none of these churches have apologized. It would be nice if they did. Some of my people, when I asked them what does healing look like for you, would an apology from the government help? Canadian government apologized in 2008 for whatever that was worth. To some people, they say, well, I'll never get my childhood back, so I don't care for an apology. Others say it would be a recognition of what happened to them. And some of them said that in Canada, that was very healing for them, that the government recognized what they did, what was done to them.
Right. Yeah. For my last question, you are a poet with 3 books to your credit. I found your poem Bitter Tears very moving, especially since I visited the Carlisle Cemetery, where around 200 young children were buried, and some in unmarked graves, far from their families. Can you please read it for us?
Yes, I would love to. Thank you. Bitter Tears. The school's maintenance man drives me to the cemetery, unlocks the sagging gate under a wrought iron arch. Stark letters, Chemawa Cemetery, 1886. Ancient fir trees tower above the graves. Weeds and wildflowers cover the small, flat plaques. Offering tobacco prayers, I gently sweep aside the weeds to read the names and the years they died. What did they die of? Loneliness? Worked to death in the barns and fields, pneumonia, a beating from the gauntlet, suicide on the tracks in front of the school. I count 21 plaques in a row with the date 1918, the year of the flu epidemic. I find plaques stamped with the years my father was a student there. Did he know this boy? That one? Were they friends? As a carpenter apprentice, did he hammer together the casket they were buried in? Was there a funeral? How were their parents told? Sap seeps down a fir tree's trunk like bitter tears, its roots tugging at a plaque, holding a lone child in embrace. I brace against a tree and weep for the children, for the parents left behind, for my father who lived, for those who didn't.
Very moving poem, very beautiful. And I have a question in the comment section. How do the youth from different tribes feel about this? Like regarding the Christian denominations and the whole, as well as the whole boarding school era.
So one tribe, was it the Cheyenne or the Rosebud Sioux? It was children had gone to Carlisle. I think you mentioned that you had gone to Carlisle, and they saw kids from their tribe that were buried there. Those young people, they started a movement to ask Carlisle, the army, to return the bodies of those babies back home. So it was the youth that started that movement, and it has grown since then. So for more tribes seeking to go to Carlisle and bring the remains of their children from their tribe back home. So so many of the young people that I talk to are in that intergenerational trauma, because even though for them now, like it's my parents that went to boarding school, I'm older, for them it's their grandparents, and they've heard their grandparents talking about it, and they start crying when they're talking about it in these conferences. So these kids are still, we're in this intergenerational trauma, they're still traumatized and grieving what happened to their grandparents and their parents. So it's still very much a painful subject here for the younger generation.
Makes sense. Do you think that your book can be translated into a lesson plan for high school students?
Wow, you want to do that? I'm looking at doing some research for the Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition. I was the first president and one of the original founding members of it. And then I was on the board, but statute of limitations or whatever. So I'm looking, they just hired a person to do head up research. So I'm hoping to work with this person. I think they were just hired last Friday to maybe get some funding to do something like just what you talked about. I would love to do that. You know, I'm an educator. I'd love to write curriculum and develop just that. I never thought of that. That's a dang good idea. Thank you. Maybe I'll propose it for them, but yeah. So, but that's a lot of time, but they have more funding now. I think they recently received a $10 million grant. So 10 years ago, we went from $5,000 to 10 million now.
Dr. Anger has a question. She has raised her hand.
Thanks, Aalok, and such a powerful presentation, Denise. I think, as you're saying, a big part of history is missed in the schools. So I was wondering if translating a book into lesson plan is one thing, and then empowering the teachers to focus on justice issues or social justice issues is also another thing. So I'm because the same thing translates into environmental justice issues. Usually in schools, we do a superficial roundup of like these justice issues because they are so challenging to even teach, and there's no answers and there's so many nuances. I don't know if you've met teachers before who have taken this to a different level where they have discussed at least some of these issues in classes and have gotten students to engage in different activities using a similar topic. I just wanted to get your insight.
Well, I know that the book has been ordered. My publisher, my editor tells me that the book has been ordered by quite a few colleges throughout the United States. So how they're teaching it, what they're doing, what they're talking about, I don't know. Yeah, but it's just that it is into most of the college, not most of them, but it's into college level classes are ordering the book. Probably mostly part of their Indian studies and so on. So that's good to hear. That was a main, but I also wanted it, I didn't want to write it, you know, in pure academia. I wanted to write it in their, that's why it's in their own words. I don't interrupt the interviewees. It's completely their story. My voice is not in there anywhere except at the very beginning to introduce them, because I wanted the general public, native and non-native, to be able to read it. It's a painful read. I have to give trigger warnings. Those that have been sexually molested and physically abused and verbally, I have to give trigger warnings that this could trigger memories of their own personal abuse. But so it's out there. I'm not sure about high school level, but I think it would be appropriate for high school. But mostly colleges have been, and individuals been ordering the book, and it's all over China. I was interviewed by a gal based in Washington, D.C. from China. I was interviewed by Al Jazeera English, ABC Nightline. They're still putting their together. It's not been posted yet. And Australia is coming up. Of course, Australia, New Zealand based their boarding schools on our boarding school model. So they'll be coming up in the spring. Once the snow melts, they'll be coming. And they'll probably be looking at unmarked graves here in the United States, which I know there are many schools that have unmarked graves.
Yeah. Has writing and publishing stories / poems helped the survivors and families process their grief?
Yeah, it certainly has helped me. My poetry, people say it's kind of tough to read, but it's my personal therapy, along with a whole lot of other talk therapy and so on. But writing, I think writing their stories helped the people that I interviewed to just get it told and know that it's out there for the world to know what happened to them. But I do like a grief writing poetry workshop and so on. So poetry to me has been extremely, extremely healing for me. So I'm working on my next book of poems. I mentioned that there's only one children's book in the United States, based in a boarding school in the United States for children. And so I'm writing, as we speak, a middle grade novel based on my father's experience at Chemawa, loosely based on his experience. So probably about another year, a good year of writing. It's hard to write. I sit there and I wrote about when he was stolen from, he was stolen from an old couple that raised him. And I just cry and cry and cry, and I have to put it away, get a headache, put it away, just writing about his story and the beating that he was almost killed in that gauntlet. So just writing about those experiences is hard on me. So then I take a break.
Sorry. Is there any like final thoughts that you'd like to share with us?
Well, thank you for this invitation. Just please pass on the information that you have here, and thank you for your research, and pass on the books.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for coming here today.
Yeah.
Thank you so
Thank you
much.
for sharing your story.
Thank you so much for your time, and fantastic to have both of you here. I think we learned a lot, and I'm sure all our other viewers who are there and across the globe will probably find it very new, but can also relate to the marginalization that they have witnessed through the colonial history that they have gone through. So it is somewhat relatable, but also not, because it's a new context and new I guess environment, and I think your story needs to be told. So I will definitely read your book and see if we can through Mission 4.7. Jasmine, what do you think? Maybe we can do like a lesson plan and put it up on our website. We have an educational resource website, which is also co-sponsored by UNESCO and Ban Ki-moon Center. So maybe this could be some, a way of bringing global citizenship as well as SDG 4.7, as Aalok mentioned, something in there. We will definitely read your book and come back to you.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you for your work.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you so much. It was an honor.
Much.
Thank you.